Welcome back to the Grand Tribe Podcast, where we believe grandparents have the power to shape not only their families, but also the future. When you hear the words climate change, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But what if this conversation isn't really about climate at all? What if it's about raising grandchildren who are resilient, adaptable, and ready for whatever life brings? Today, I'm joined by nationally recognized author and climate advocate Harry R. or Rick Moody. Together, we'll explore why the greatest legacy we can leave our grandchildren isn't just what we own. It's the confidence, wisdom, and adaptability they need to thrive in a changing world. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and join my conversation with Rick. The moments your grandchildren remember most are the ones you share together. With Road Scholars Grandparent Adventures, you'll explore incredible destinations, learn from expert instructors, and discover the world side by side. From national parks to wildlife encounters and hands-on cultural experiences, these programs are designed to bring generations closer through the joy of learning and travel. Learn more at roadscholar.org/grandadventures. Hi, Harry. How are you doing today?
Welcome
Welcome on to the Grand Tribe Podcast. We're excited to have you on. Now, I want to dive in because this is such a great topic, meaning climate change and everything that grandparents can do to be not just sitting back on the sidelines and reactive, but what we can do to be proactive. So, what I'd love for you to do is give us and set up a frame of reference, right? Because a lot of us haven't been in 8th grade science class, and we want to define what's climate versus what's weather, and then also climate periods. Help us understand what that is.
Good questions. Part of the problem here is that these terms are a little ambiguous. And people talk about climate and weather in ways that is sometimes confusing. But the main point that I would make is that we usually think of climate as something that is permanent, lasts a long time. We're here in North America, or I'm in California. Where are you located right now?
I'm in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay. You're probably having a lot more heat than I am right here in California, this part of California anyway. So even in a particular state like California, the climate can vary from one part of the state to another. California happens to be a very big state, so that you can have a terrible heat wave in one part of the state, the Central Valley, for example, whereas here it's kind of cold and I have to use a sweater. That's just an example of how climate can actually vary from place to place, but within that place, it tends to be pretty much the same. Of course, there are variations from the seasons, and I want to come back to that because one of the big things that we're facing today is that the climate that my grandchildren, and that's why I live here in California, by the way. I moved here deliberately just to be near my 3 grandchildren, little girls. The reason why we are concerned about climate is because it is changing. That is, in the future, it will not be the same as what we grew up with. I'll give you one example of that. I don't know if you're a gardener, but we plant things at a certain time. When spring comes, when the flowers come, that sort of thing. And the same in the fall, things fall down, literally. And the problem with that is that the climate time is changing, the season time is changing, so that it used to be that the climate was completely predictable, but now spring is coming earlier, a week or two earlier in different parts of this country. That's an example of why we need to prepare our grandchildren for a world that is very different from the world that we as elders grew up in. That's my answer to the question of climate versus weather. Weather is always changing. Climate is now changing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, is that it's a longer term, year over year. And when you start to see, like you said, when you start to see your planting season get earlier and earlier on the calendar, then that's an indicator that the climate is changing.
That's not such a terrible thing, if we have to plant things 2 weeks earlier. But I'll give you another example. I used to live in Colorado, rather, before I moved to California. Um, Colorado is a state where skiing is very important. Skiing depends upon snow. What happens when the snow is not there? Big problem. You can create some artificial snow. It's not the same. And people might say, well, okay, too bad for skiing. Doesn't bother me. What about water? Do you need water? Uh, I like to think of climate change in terms of what I call the four horsemen of the climate apocalypse. And what are those four horsemen? Fire, flood, heat wave, and drought. These are very threatening things. I don't need to make the point about fire and flood because those are very dramatic. And we have those a lot here in California, particularly fires. But what about drought? Well, drought depends upon water, lack of water, and that in turn is very much influenced by snowfall. So climate is already affecting snowfall, is already affecting water and drought. And the main point that I would make about climate change is that it is already here. It is not just the future. It's here and now, and people have to start adapting right away.
I think that's one of the biggest things that we're starting to see is that adaptation, right? Because being out here, I see the headlines about was it Lake Mead?
Lake Mead it's dramatically lower, and that's an example of why drought. Now, fortunately, California is such a big state that we get water from different places. For example, the water here, I live near San Francisco, just south of San Francisco. The water that we get comes out of my tap, doesn't come from Lake Mead. It comes from the Sierra Mountains. And so far, the snowfall there has been pretty good. And this year, anyway, 2026, we're getting the water that we need. But this can change. And we certainly know that that's true with fires and floods. And it's also true for heat waves. Right now, I'm speaking on, what's the date today? I'm just looking for a moment. Yes, July 14th. It's
14th.
Exactly. July 14th is the big holiday in France, Bastille Day. We're not celebrating it here in the USA. That's okay. The key point about what's going on right now in July is heat wave. I checked the weather this morning and discovered, wow, the heat is going to be a lot bigger today. Now, for us in this part of California that I'm living in, a big heat wave right here means the temperature might go up to 75 or 80 degrees. That's a big heat wave for us. But if I were to be just a few miles from here in the Central Valley, or if I were to be in Arizona, heat waves can be fatal. And they're already fatal to people, particularly people who have to work out of doors. So when we're thinking about how we can prepare our grandchildren for the world of the future, we need to be thinking about all of those four horsemen of the climate apocalypse. And we need to get them to think about what that will be like in a place where they're living. But do they know where they're living? If you're a grandchild, like my youngest granddaughter is only 2 years old, does she know where she's going to be living 20 years from now? Probably not. Life changes. So we need to be prepared for the whole realm, the whole domain of these climate impacts that are already happening, and they're likely to get a lot worse in the world that our grandchildren are living in. That's the key point that I made, where we can't take account of the past. We can learn from the past. For example, we can learn from COVID, or in my case, I was one of the polio pioneers. I got the first polio vaccine in 1955. We didn't know if the vaccine would even work. Something similar happened with COVID. Now, why do I mention these infectious disorders? Because very likely that climate change will spread insects and other vectors, to use the technical term, that transmit diseases. So climate change is not just about how you feel about the weather, or is it hot or cold or humidity and so on. That's clearly going to be important. And as I said, it can be fatal. But there are other things that are affected by climate, and that includes disease and health.
Well, and I like that you brought up the example of your granddaughter not knowing where she's going to live. And when we're starting to think in terms of being grandparents, uh, a lot of us think legacy sometimes is what's the money I can leave? What's the real estate I can leave? What are maybe some words of wisdom I can leave? But how do you help grandparents begin thinking of leaving and helping to create or maintain a healthy planet as one of the great inheritances that we can leave for our grandchildren?
Well, that would be a great idea if we could leave a healthy planet. And it may be possible for us to do things that intervene, that make a difference, but we may not know what they are exactly. I'll give you one example of that. I learned only a few days ago something that I never knew before. I knew about the ozone layer, for example. I knew about that because I knew that people in Australia have been dramatically impacted because they live in a different place on planet Earth from sunlight, and the the rate of skin cancer and other ailments from the sunlight had been substantially, dramatically increased in Australia because of a decline in the ozone layer. Now, we did something to fix that by changing how refrigerators are constructed and how emissions from refrigerators come out in terms of the impact of those chemicals. Uh, but I learned only a few days ago that satellites falling from high, satellites going around the Earth, yeah, they do go around the Earth, but at some point they generally fall to Earth. And when that happens, they affect the ozone layer, which in turn can affect our health and our climate. I learned this personally just a week ago when I had a biopsy and they discovered that I have a slow-growing cancer, skin cancer. Why? Because when I was growing up, I spent a lot of time on the beach, Jones Beach in the South Shore of Long Island. Nobody knew much about skin cancer or things like that then, but they do now. Well, can we do anything about that? Maybe we can. We did something about the ozone layer previously. We might be able to do something about so many satellites, maybe too many satellites. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just giving that as an example of something where climate itself can change, not just weather, but climate can change because we're changing the Earth. Nobody knew that we were changing the Earth by sending satellites up. Nobody knew that we were changing the Earth by having a refrigerator. All these things are connected. And what can we do for our grandchildren? We can teach them that adaptation is necessary because we can't predict the future. We can't know exactly the impact of all the things that we as human beings are doing to affect the Earth on which we live. That's what I want to say.
Well, and I like that you brought up the adaptation part of it because I would love to get your insights on how do we use technologies, how do we use new knowledge in adapting to change of climate while also trying to be good stewards of the earth so that we don't worsen our impact.
Yeah. Well, you're asking absolutely the right question. And I think the answer is that adaptation can be learned. And how do we learn it? Well, I'll give you one example of that. I'm an Eagle Scout. I got my Eagle Scout award in 1960. That's a long time ago now. I was 15 years old at the time. You can calculate my age by that little example. I'm 81 at the moment. But of that example is that I had to learn a lot about nature. I grew up in the suburbs. I didn't know much about nature, but they put us out into nature and we had to adapt very quickly as Boy Scouts. We had to learn how to build fires, how to put out fires, how to deal with cooking and all these kinds of things, as well as life-saving merit badge, which was the hard one for me in terms of coping with water. My point about all this is that people can learn to cope with adaptation, but they need to learn it early. And today, we were living in a world that's, as I said before, quite different from the world that we grew up in. I'm 81 years old. I graduated from college in 1967. Things were pretty good in 1967. It was a good year for the economy. Um, I went to a very prestigious college, Yale University. People in my situation had the whole world available to us. Is that true today? I don't think so. Today, you can graduate from a really good college, and what you can learn is what you need to do to become a barista in Starbucks. That's your career, because the economy has changed so much. So what people can really learn from college is not what they majored in, not what they specialized in, but what they can do to adapt to something completely unforeseen, something unexpected. I'll give you one more example of that. When I was at Yale, I noticed that you're a white guy. I'm white too. Uh, I never had much contact with black people. But when I was at Yale, I had to earn some money. So they sent me on a tour all throughout the South. You're in the South right now in Georgia. That's one of the states I visited. They sent me around being a traveling photographer in black colleges. I was in the college. I was the only white man in a room of 1,000 black people. That was a big experience for me. I had to quickly learn how to adapt. I learned that black people are no different from white people. If you have 1,000 hanging around you, pretty soon you get adapted. And I think that can happen with climate issues too. That doesn't mean we should sit back and pretend that everything's going to be okay. It's not okay. And we need to be prepared to cope with unexpected things, and to adapt quickly, not taking a long time. Because that's what happens with fire and flood, by the way. Those happen very, very quickly. Drought, slower. Heat wave, also slower. And maybe that gives us some time to adapt. But other things, we need to adapt very, very quickly.
I love that, because I think that's one of the things I'm starting to stress with young people that I work with is being able to have whether we call them soft skills, those are the things that you can take from career to career, job to job, and you have to be able to adapt those. Those are the only things you really truly own. And so I love the idea of having that flexibility mindset to an extent
Yeah,
that you
that's what it
can
is. That's exactly.
apply those lessons A to situation B.
When you were 5 or 10 years old, did you grow up thinking you were going to become a podcaster or an interviewer? Was that your main goal in life? Maybe it was.
No, I mean, this is some of us in the space talk about like this, I don't know, job or hobby or whatever it is didn't exist even 20 something years ago.
I know. I know. I know. And that's true of, I'm sitting here with my computer, looking into my screen. That didn't exist 20 years ago. So I've had to, and this is hard, by the way, for older people, for somebody my age. We have to learn very quickly how to deal with, I don't necessarily know much about programming, but I certainly had to learn how to deal with a new version of Windows 11 instead of Windows 10. So the technology is constantly changing, and that's good in a way because it keeps us on our toes. It keeps us available for a climate that's changing too. In the old days, if I could speak about the time in which I was growing up, let's say the 1950s, things were pretty much the same from year to year, and the climate was pretty predictable. Not much change. That's not the world that we're living in. And the world that our grandchildren are going to be growing up in is even more needing adaptation. And that means flexibility. You put your finger right on it, Greg. Right on it.
Well, thank you. And one thing I would like to pivot over a little bit is I'm working more and more with younger people, partly as my new career path as a elementary school teacher. I know that I'm seeing a lot of middle school kids, even upper elementary, high school kids, that they get so much information, a lot of it negative about climate change, what
Yes.
are some things that grandparents can do to share our experiences with rapid change with those children? So, not to say everything's going to be fine, but to also give some reassurance that those skills that we were talking about, your ability to adapt, can be a way to manage change for them.
That's the right question. The answer is only partly based on what we as grandparents tell the children. We can tell them some things, but what's more important is what they do with their life, what they do with their time. And in my case, in our case of our grandchildren, uh, they're they're living just a half hour from where I'm sitting right now. We're very fortunate. We deliberately moved here just to be near them. Our daughter is very careful about how much TV they watch. They watch very limited amounts of TV, and they learn to create their own worlds through their own toys, their own activities. And they're very, very good at it. Every time I go there, I see a different kind of structure that they've put together in the living room in some place. How is that possible? It's possible because there's very limited amount of their time that's spent sitting around watching a screen, watching TV. They do a little of that, and it's very carefully selected, but not much. And that's just within the home. They also spend a lot of time going to nature. Again, it's very easy for us here in California because you don't have to drive very far to get to even the Sierra Mountains, Yosemite, things like that. You have to do some driving. Driving is not always a good thing because driving also has its impact on climate. Fortunately, our daughter has a car and an EV, and they also have solar power from their house. I can't do that because I live in a condo. I don't have the ability to do that with solar. So there are things that you can do, and you can show your children by what you do, not by what you say, by going into nature and by learning how to adapt to a completely different situation in the park or the natural world that you're going to, because each time they go to a different place. If they were just going to a motel, that would have limited value. But if they go out into nature, as I did as an Eagle Scout, I learned things that have stayed with me my whole life. So, by the way, the girls are in Girl Scouts too, so they're learning those things. As a matter of fact, I just learned last week that they went through an adaptation program for how to cope with things that are unexpected. So things like the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts are training kids in just this way. They don't even talk about climate change or things like that, but they're training them to adapt and to prepare. Be prepared, by the way. That was the traditional Boy Scout motto. Be prepared. Well, how do you prepare for the unexpected? You learn to adapt and be flexible. That's how you prepare.
Well, and I love that. And I'd love to ask you a follow-up around the same question
Sure.
because with your scouting background and your growing up, my scouting background, how do you feel like maybe we've stepped away from that traditional, I guess it would be conservation mindset, whether it's walking out, cleaning up a trail, doing some of those things that we used to do. I remember on my hikes, our scoutmaster would always be like, "Hey, you got to pick up 5 pieces of trash on the
That's good.
trail,"
That's
that
good.
sort of thing.
You give that as an example. It's a very good example, because if we had more and more people picking up 5 pieces of trash or something comparable, that becomes a habit very, very quickly. And pretty soon, by the time they're in another situation, not in a park or in a natural setting, so-called, then they're still going to be thinking, wait a minute, I better pick that up. I do that all the time myself. My wife does it too. We just bend over. It's not as easy to bend over as it was when I was younger, but we do it. Pick it up. Each person is responsible. That is a kind of an ethical principle. instead of thinking, well, somebody else will take care of it. By the way, that's one of the biggest problems that we have in climate advocacy. I'll call myself a climate advocacy person here. People feel paralyzed. They feel complacent. If they hear about the problem threatening climate, they think, well, I won't be around to see it. Maybe you won't be around. I won't be around. I'm 81 years old, but my grandchildren will be around to see it. That's important. Don't be complacent. Don't think other people will take care of it. Think, what can I do? I do that every single day. Every single day, I send at least 40 messages to major leaders, legislators, business executives, media managers about climate change on my cell phone. So I'm not against technology. I think we can use technology as a liberating force. We have to find out how to do it.
And what do you advise grandparents? Because I think sometimes the news about climate, while it's important to understand the impacts that are going on, the changes, how do you advise people to also allow the conversation that we're going to figure things out. Things are going to be positive, because I think sometimes teenagers, especially young adults that may be our grandchildren, get so pessimistic that maybe they don't do those little things that we were talking about.
You have to give them concrete examples and stories. I'll give you one example. You've heard of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the poorest countries in the world. They're facing a problem of climate change with rising ocean levels and changes in the rivers that come out of the Himalayas. What do they do about that? You can't say to 100 million people, just leave and go someplace else. They're living right next to India. They're living one of the most populated places on the planet Earth. What do? They figured out how, in Bangladesh, how to build on higher and higher levels floating cities, very similar to what they're doing in the Netherlands, which is a very rich country, but it's a country that was created out of filling in the ocean. Most of the Netherlands is landfill that people have created in the last 800 years, and now that is threatened. In the Netherlands, they figured out a collective solution in terms of blockades and dams and things like that that enable them to adapt to rising sea level. In Bangladesh, they have a different situation. They don't have the money to be building dams or structures. So they change the way that they build their regular buildings to be floating buildings, floating houses. And they're already doing that, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. Now, my point of those two examples is that countries can do this, but so can individuals. When individuals start thinking, what can I do? And they hear stories like that people have done elsewhere, including stories about coping with fire and flood. It's a big danger for us to talk about climate change entirely in negative terms. I publish a newsletter, which I edit every week, called Climate Change in an Aging Society. It goes to 1,200 people. I do another newsletter that goes to 5,000 people every month. The point of those newsletters is to give them positive examples of things that people can do about aging or about climate change or about both. What can you do? Well, let's give you a story. Let's tell you what other people have done, and you can learn from that story too. That's the key point. It's so important not to just stress the negative, but to stress the opportunities. If we don't do that, then people are going to become pessimistic, just like what you described. And pessimism is the same thing ultimately as cynicism, namely the feeling, I can't do anything. Nobody can do anything. That's wrong. People can do something, and every person can make a difference.
I love that mentality, and I love that answer, because I think sometimes, whether it's life in general or whether it has to do with the climate, when you feel like you can't take action or you don't have a piece that you can be responsible for, it feels overwhelming. And then that adds, I think, more and more to that feeling of helplessness and that feeling that whatever you do isn't going to matter.
That's right. And I won't get into the politics of things, but what I will say is this, that we have a lot of polarization in America today, and we have a lot of feeling on the part of some leaders who are telling us the government can't do anything. Nothing works anymore. That's not true. Every month I get my Social Security check without fail. I get other things taken care of without fail. Now, fortunately, I live in a place where things are pretty well organized, just south of San Francisco. But even I am subject to unexpected bad climate events, flooding. A couple of years ago, even though I live on high ground, I live on the top of a big hill here in San Mateo, which is the name of the town that I live in. I thought, well, I don't have to worry about water. That's for people who live right next to the ocean or next to San Francisco Bay. It's not true. One night just before New Year's Eve, we were driving home, and my wife and I discovered that we were in the middle of a flood. Every street that we went on was flooded. It wasn't normally flooded, but it was that night, New Year's Eve, and we barely made it home. How do you prepare for that? Well, I suppose you could get some kind of a Jeep or a car or something, but we didn't have that. We had a very ordinary car, and we had to adapt very quickly to a situation. There were people who drowned, actually, that time. And you can be subject to flood and to fire anywhere that you live. And you need to at least think about that. For example, the room that I'm sitting in right now, I have an emergency bag. Both my wife and I have emergency bags, very carefully prepared. You can find out what you need to put into it. Now, I happen to live just 2 miles from the San Andreas Fault. So I think about earthquakes. And we can't do anything about earthquakes, right? It's not like climate where you can maybe modify the ozone layer or think about building a dam for the floods. You can't do anything about the San Andreas Fault or earthquakes, but you can prepare. You can think about it. And don't think that you are helpless. You are not helpless. You can prepare that emergency bag. Not everybody has an emergency bag. Not everybody has instructions in their car for what to do if they get into trouble. That's an example. You don't become a pessimist. I'm not a pessimist. People don't say, Moody, he's a pessimist. No, it's not true. I think of it the way that people do in like a basketball game or a football game where, let's say football is better than basketball. You have halftime. And if your team is losing, the coach doesn't say, well, we're losing. Too bad. I guess it's hopeless. There's nothing we can do in the rest of the game. He shouldn't be a coach. You need a coach who can say, okay, we're behind. Here's the way that we change our strategy, our tactics. Okay, quarterback, you need to behave in a different way, and so on. That's an example of what I mean, whether it's in sports or earthquakes, where people can actually prepare and can change. We come back to adaptation, Greg, which you mentioned at the very beginning, adaptation. We can do it. Send that message. Other people can do it. They can change. You can change. We can change. We can do it. That's the American way, by the way. Americans want to believe that. And people have gotten discouraged lately because they've gotten a lot of bad news from media, because media specializes in bad stories. We need to specialize in good stories and figuring out what we can do. And that's what I try to do in everything that I do with my life and my activity.
Well, and I love that approach, especially I think for grandparents, is maybe we set up our Google alerts for good news when it comes to climate and when it comes to these different things. As an example of that, I am fascinated by these people that have created ways to go out and collect plastic out of the ocean.
Yes.
And do some of that. And you're right, that doesn't get a 45-minute spread on CNN or whatever. It gets 2 seconds.
It's absolutely true. And But the good thing about that is that you can take pictures of people collecting plastic or whatever else we're talking about. So pictures are very important. And I tell people, when you communicate about climate or about other things, always talk about pictures and stories and pictures. That's the way that they don't have to be long. And the picture does not have to be elaborate or complicated. Just the opposite. In the newsletters that I do, I use a lot of cartoons. I use cartoons because I think when you're talking about aging or you're talking about climate, you're talking about things that people easily get depressed about. And that's why they need humor. They need laughs. They need cartoons. They need pictures. And they need pictures of people, real people who've done real things, so that they don't just get the negative side of things. We can do this. I can do it. That's how I live my life. I focus on stories and pictures and stories. And that's how I live.
I love that. As speaking with grandparents, is that I know there's a thing called what we've termed the generation gap, but I'm wondering about the wisdom gap in terms of younger people have so much access to information and they know how to grab it quickly. I think older parents and grandparents, we've got that wisdom that's come from that learned experience. And I'd love for you to think about, how do we help marry those two experiences up? Maybe grandkids share information that we don't know, but maybe we also share the wisdom of that learned experience about, hey, this is how we can move forward with whatever this challenge might be.
You have to distinguish between information, knowledge, and wisdom. Information is not knowledge. Knowledge is how we make sense of information. Knowledge is not wisdom. Wisdom is understanding what is the right thing to do at the right time, in the right place. We get wisdom from other people by their example, by how they behave, how they lead their lives. We do not get wisdom by people telling us things, giving us, ways of, you do this, don't do that. Pretty soon, young people turn off when they hear things like that. That's not how they get wisdom. And if they hear that, they don't think of the old people as wise. They think of the old people as fools who just repeat the same thing over and over again. And that's not the right way to go. The right way to go, in the case of the elders like me, I help people with fundraising. You know how I do that? I tell them I'm an expert in fundraising because I've done everything wrong. And let me tell you all the things where I've made a mistake. And here are all the mistakes I've made. 1, 2, 3, 4. And when they hear that, they hear, wow, this guy's telling the truth. He's willing to admit his mistakes. He's willing to learn from his mistakes and share them with me. That is the way to go, by focusing not on our so-called wisdom, but on our mistakes and the things that we've done wrong, and that maybe we've learned from our mistakes, and help other people, help our grandchildren learn not to make our mistakes. So that's how I come to wisdom. It's not something that I have. Wisdom is actually the exact opposite of something that you have. Wisdom, people who are wise, Socrates was known as the wisest person in ancient Greece. Why was he wise? Because he said, I know nothing. He claimed that he knew nothing. So the people who are wisest are the ones who know very little, because they know that they know nothing. It takes a lot of life and a lot of wisdom, if I can put it that way, to realize that most of what you know amounts to nothing. In the case of today's old people like me, the worlds that we've lived in are gone. And therefore, we really do know nothing about how to help my son, who's 38 years old. He's a computer programming expert. Made a lot of money in the computer business. I talked to him just the other night for an hour and a half. I didn't try to tell him about computer things. He knows everything about that. He wanted to know something about how to cope with people, how to deal with people at a conference. He didn't know much about going to conferences. He listened very carefully. He always listens carefully, because I never try to tell him things that I don't know anything about. I tell him the things that I'd made mistakes about. He listens to that.
I think we have that in common because I try to pass on to my boys all the bumps and bruises that I've learned along the way, hoping
Good for
that
you.
they don't necessarily make the same mistakes and that they make completely new mistakes that they can
They'll
own.
make their own mistakes, and they'll learn from that, and they'll pass that along too. But it's a big challenge to recognizing what you don't know. So the way of knowing is actually the way of unknowing, and it's possible to cultivate that and to remember it. It's not easy because we like to, gee, let me tell you about all the great things I've done. A lot of old people are like that. Don't listen to that. Listen to the ones who tell you about their mistakes.
That's good advice. And as we start to wrap this up,
Sure.
what's a piece of advice that you would like to leave with the Grand Tribe when it comes to grandparents and grandchildren in the climate and how maybe all three of those things can come together?
4 words. You can do it. You. You have the ability. You can. Do. Action. It's important. Not what you think, not what you say. Doing. That's what's important. It. What's the it? The it is the world that you're facing in, including the threats, including the 4 horsemen of the climate apocalypse. Don't think of it as somebody else. Think of it as something that affects you, and therefore you can do it. That's my advice.
I love that. And Harry, as we start to sign off, is there anything about grandparenting, about climate that we haven't touched on that you would like to bring up?
No, I think that the, the main thing that I would add is that we're living in a world where a lot of people in power in the federal government aren't interested in climate action. Some people even dismiss it as a hoax. It's not true. You can see that it's happening if you open your eyes. And you should not be discouraged by the fact that people in power dismiss things. You should be encouraged by people who you know, including perhaps your own grandparents, who are acting and who are making the world better. Move towards action, move towards hope. Don't move towards hopelessness.
I love that. And Harry, it's been fantastic having you on the Grand Tribe podcast, and I really do appreciate the time you spent with us today.
I'm honored. I'm honored that you called me, or I called you, whoever called each other. I'm honored that you included me in your program, and I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing. I'm really glad. You've made my day. The day's beginning just for me. It's only 20 to 8 here in California. It's later for you in Georgia, but you know what I'm saying. Thank you. Thank you, Greg.
Absolutely. This has been a blast and really have appreciated it. The moments your grandchildren remember most are the ones you share together. With Road Scholars Grandparent Adventures, you'll explore incredible destinations, learn from expert instructors, and discover the world side by side. From national parks to wildlife encounters and hands-on cultural experiences, these programs are designed to bring generations closer through the joy of learning and travel. Learn more at roadscholar.org/grandadventures.